The most dangerous mistake is judging a stranger before you know why he is smiling. The lunch rush had already begun when the bell above the front door chimed inside Miller's Diner, a family-owned restaurant just outside Dallas, Texas, where regular customers filled nearly every booth, and the smell of fresh coffee, grilled burgers, and homemade pie floated through the air. Waitresses hurried between tables balancing plates while conversations blended into the familiar soundtrack of another ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Nothing about that moment suggested anyone would remember it by sunset. Two black men stepped inside without drawing attention to themselves. Marcus Reed, 43, carried himself with quiet confidence beneath a simple denim jacket, dark jeans, and well-worn boots. Beside him walked Elijah Brooks, 39, dressed in a gray hoodie beneath a lightweight work jacket, his calm eyes slowly scanning the room without appearing to do so. They looked like two friends stopping for lunch after a long morning. They nodded politely to the hostess, accepted a booth near the front window, and thanked her with easy smiles before sitting down. Neither man seemed interested in attracting attention. In fact, they appeared almost determined to blend into the crowd. Marcus picked up the menu but barely glanced at it, while Elijah casually stirred packets of sugar into the coffee the waitress had just poured. Every movement seemed relaxed, almost rehearsed in its simplicity. Across the diner, families laughed over sandwiches, retirees debated baseball scores, and construction workers compared weekend fishing plans. It was the kind of place where strangers often greeted one another with a friendly nod. Yet beneath the ordinary atmosphere, Marcus quietly noticed every reflection in the windows, every customer entering the parking lot, and every vehicle slowing along the highway outside. Elijah occasionally glanced toward the entrance before returning his attention to the steaming coffee cup in front of him. Neither exchanged more than a few words, but they did not need to. Years of working together had replaced long conversations with silent understanding. Outside, a marked police cruiser rolled into the parking lot. The engine shut off, and Officer Daniel Harper adjusted his duty belt before stepping into the warm Texas afternoon. He had spent nearly 12 years wearing the badge and believed experience had taught him to trust his instincts. As he entered the diner, several regular customers greeted him by name. Harper smiled politely, exchanged brief comments with the owner, and accepted a fresh cup of coffee without asking. His eyes naturally swept across the room, checking every occupied table with practiced routine. Then his gaze settled on Marcus and Elijah. They were doing nothing unusual. They spoke quietly. They waited patiently for their food. Yet Harper continued watching them for several long seconds before slowly narrowing his eyes. Something about them, he decided almost instantly, did not belong. He could not explain why. The feeling simply settled into his mind, growing stronger with every passing moment. Marcus noticed the stare without lifting his head. Elijah caught the reflection of the uniform in the diner window and calmly reached for his coffee instead of reacting. Around them, nobody realized that an ordinary lunch had quietly become the opening move in a story that would soon challenge every assumption inside that little Texas diner. Officer Daniel Harper accepted the steaming coffee from the owner with a polite nod, but his attention never drifted far from the booth near the front window. Marcus Reed unfolded his napkin with unhurried precision while Elijah Brooks thanked the waitress as she set down 2 glasses of iced tea before promising to return with their lunch order. Nothing about their behavior disturbed the peaceful rhythm of the diner, yet Harper continued watching them as though he expected something unusual to happen at any moment. After another long sip of coffee, he crossed the dining room at an unhurried pace and stopped beside their table. Conversations nearby softened as regular customers noticed the uniform standing over the 2 men. Marcus looked up first, offering a calm smile. "Good afternoon, officer." Harper returned only a brief nod. "Mind telling me what brings you 2 here today?" His voice remained controlled, but the question carried enough weight to change the atmosphere inside the room. Marcus answered without hesitation. "Lunch. We have been on the road all morning." Elijah quietly stirred his tea, saying nothing else. Harper glanced from one face to the other before asking another question. "Are you from around here?" Marcus replied, "No, sir. We are passing through." The answer seemed ordinary enough, but Harper did not appear satisfied. His eyes drifted toward their jackets, their boots, and the small travel bag resting beneath the booth. He noticed details that most people would never have considered important, yet he ignored dozens of equally ordinary explanations that could have answered every concern. The waitress returned carrying 2 plates stacked high with cheeseburgers and fries. She paused when she realized the conversation had become unusually serious. "Everything all right?" she asked gently. Harper answered before either customer could respond. "Just asking a few questions." She forced an uneasy smile and carefully placed the meals on the table before walking away. Marcus thanked her warmly and reached for a fry as though nothing had changed. Elijah unfolded his napkin and quietly began eating. Their relaxed confidence somehow made Harper even more suspicious. Across the diner, several customers exchanged uncertain glances. The owner polished a coffee mug behind the counter while pretending not to watch. A retired couple near the window stopped talking altogether. Even the familiar clatter of silverware seemed quieter than before. Harper folded his arms. "I would like to see some identification." Marcus looked directly at him with the same calm expression he had worn since entering the diner. "May I ask whether there is a particular reason?" Harper answered, "Routine observation." Marcus slowly reached toward his back pocket, but paused before removing his wallet. His eyes briefly met Elijah's. No words passed between them, yet both understood that every second mattered for reasons nobody else inside the diner could possibly imagine. Outside the front windows, another pickup truck rolled into the parking lot before continuing past the restaurant. Elijah followed it only with a quick glance before returning his attention to the untouched burger sitting on his plate. Harper noticed the movement immediately and interpreted it as confirmation that his instincts were correct. What he could not possibly know was that the quiet lunch he believed he was interrupting had already become part of something far larger than anyone in that small Texas diner was prepared to witness. Marcus slowly removed his wallet from his back pocket, but kept it resting on the table instead of immediately handing it over. His movements remained steady, measured, and almost impossibly calm. Elijah continued eating a few fries without showing the slightest sign of concern. To anyone watching, they appeared to be 2 ordinary travelers interrupted during lunch. Officer Daniel Harper interpreted their composure very differently. In his experience, confidence often meant someone believed they could outsmart the situation. He leaned slightly closer to the table, lowering his voice just enough to keep the conversation contained while still making it clear that he expected complete cooperation. "I asked for identification," he repeated. Marcus nodded politely. "I heard you, officer. I simply asked whether there was a specific concern." Harper answered without hesitation. "You are making people uncomfortable." Marcus slowly glanced around the dining room. Families were quietly eating. A young couple shared a milkshake near the counter. An elderly man smiled at the waitress as she refilled his coffee. Nobody appeared alarmed until Harper himself had approached their booth. Marcus returned his attention to the officer. Everyone seemed to be enjoying lunch before this conversation began. Harper did not respond to that observation. Instead, he noticed Elijah briefly checking the large clock hanging above the pie display. It lasted only a second, but Harper immediately connected the movement to his growing suspicion. He believed the 2 men were waiting for something. What he could not know was that Elijah had been tracking time with remarkable precision since they entered the diner. Every minute mattered, although not for any reason Harper imagined. Outside, another vehicle entered the parking lot before slowly circling the building and continuing toward the rear alley. Elijah watched its reflection in the front window rather than turning his head directly toward it. Marcus noticed the same movement through the polished stainless steel coffee dispenser behind the counter. Their silent awareness came from years of experience working together, yet neither man gave away the importance of what they had just seen. Harper interpreted their brief glances as another reason to remain where he stood. Behind the counter, the diner owner quietly approached one of the waitresses. "Maybe they just want to eat," she whispered. The owner sighed softly. "I hope this ends soon. Nobody comes here looking for trouble." The waitress nodded and resumed serving customers, although she found herself looking toward booth 7 every few moments. The room had become strangely divided. Some customers avoided looking altogether, pretending nothing unusual was happening. Others watched openly, uncertain whether they should intervene or remain silent. The familiar comfort of the diner had been replaced by an uneasy stillness that seemed to spread with every passing second. Harper folded his notebook closed and looked directly at Marcus once again. I think it would be better if you two finish this conversation outside. Marcus met his eyes without raising his voice or changing his expression. Officer, we ordered lunch, and we intend to pay for it like everyone else here. Elijah calmly placed his coffee cup back onto its saucer with quiet precision. Somewhere beyond the front windows, almost hidden by the afternoon traffic, a dark sport utility vehicle slowed as it approached the diner before disappearing briefly from sight, and neither Marcus nor Elijah reacted, because the most important rule of their assignment was simple: never reveal the mission until the mission revealed itself. Officer Daniel Harper remained beside the booth, convinced that asking Marcus Reed and Elijah Brooks to step outside was the most reasonable course of action. The two men exchanged a brief glance before Marcus answered with the same quiet respect that had defined every word he had spoken since entering the diner. Officer, we are happy to cooperate within the law, but we also do not wish to leave our meal unfinished without understanding why. Harper heard the answer as resistance instead of calm professionalism. His expression hardened slightly, although he kept his voice measured. I believe it will be easier if we continue this conversation outside. Around the diner, conversations had nearly stopped altogether. Forks rested on plates. Coffee cups remained untouched. Even the jukebox near the entrance seemed strangely quiet beneath the growing tension. The owner glanced nervously toward the front windows before checking the clock hanging behind the register. He had built this diner over 25 years by making every customer feel welcome, and he could sense that something far beyond an ordinary disagreement was unfolding inside his restaurant. Marcus slowly folded his napkin and placed it beside his plate without touching the burger that had already begun to cool. Elijah quietly looked toward the entrance again, his attention lingering for only a heartbeat before returning to Harper. Neither man appeared nervous. Neither appeared angry. Instead, they carried themselves with remarkable patience, almost as though they had expected this exact moment long before they walked through the front door. Harper noticed their composure and interpreted it as confidence born from hiding something important. What he could not understand was that both men were measuring every decision against a responsibility that reached far beyond the walls of Miller's Diner. Outside, the same dark sport utility vehicle slowly returned, this time stopping briefly across the street before continuing another 50 yards. Moments later, a delivery van parked near the rear entrance exactly where dozens of delivery vehicles had parked over the years. To every customer inside, nothing about those arrivals seemed unusual. To Marcus and Elijah, however, each movement fit perfectly into a timetable they had memorized days earlier. Marcus glanced at the clock once more. Less than 4 minutes remained. Harper stepped slightly closer to the booth. Last opportunity. I need you both to come outside. Marcus looked directly at him with calm eyes. Officer, may I ask one question? Harper nodded cautiously. Go ahead. Marcus spoke quietly enough that only Harper could clearly hear him. Have we done anything illegal since we entered this diner? The question lingered in the silence. Harper searched for an immediate answer, but instead found himself repeating the same feeling that had guided every decision since he first noticed the two men. I am following my instincts. Marcus gave a small, respectful nod. Instincts are valuable. Evidence is even better. Before Harper could respond, the bell above the front door chimed once again. Every head in the diner instinctively turned toward the entrance as 3 professionally dressed individuals stepped inside with calm purpose, scanning the room before one of them immediately fixed his attention on Marcus Reed. And in that single quiet moment, the atmosphere inside the diner shifted in a way that nobody except Marcus and Elijah had anticipated. The 3 newcomers moved through the diner with quiet confidence that immediately felt different from ordinary customers. They were dressed in business attire rather than uniforms, yet every step reflected purpose and discipline. The man in front scanned the room only once before walking directly toward booth 7. Officer Daniel Harper instinctively shifted his position, believing they might also have questions about the unusual situation unfolding inside the restaurant. Instead, the newcomer stopped beside Marcus Reed and spoke in a calm, professional voice that carried clearly through the suddenly silent dining room. Detective Reed, we have confirmation. The subject has entered the area exactly on schedule. Marcus slowly looked up from the untouched lunch on the table and gave a single nod. Elijah Brooks quietly placed his coffee cup down and stood beside his partner. Harper frowned with visible confusion. "Detective," he repeated almost to himself. The second newcomer produced a small credential wallet, opening it just long enough for Marcus and Elijah to verify the identification before closing it again. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it was enough to change the atmosphere inside the diner completely. Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and calmly removed a leather credential case of his own. He opened it briefly toward the arriving team before returning it to his pocket. Elijah did the same. Their movements were practiced, discreet, and entirely professional. Harper's expression shifted from certainty to disbelief. The two quiet travelers he had questioned throughout lunch were not ordinary visitors passing through town. They were undercover detectives assigned to an active investigation. Marcus turned toward Harper with the same composed expression he had maintained from the beginning. There was no anger in his voice, no satisfaction, and no attempt to embarrass the officer in front of dozens of witnesses. "Officer Harper," he said respectfully, "our assignment required us to remain unidentified until this exact moment." Harper stared at him without speaking. Every assumption he had made over the past several minutes suddenly collapsed under the weight of a reality he had never considered. The customers throughout the diner exchanged astonished glances. The waitress quietly covered her mouth with one hand. The owner slowly lowered the coffee mug he had been drying, unable to look away. Marcus continued speaking calmly. "We have been conducting a long-term undercover operation connected to an ongoing criminal investigation. Maintaining our cover has been essential for protecting the integrity of that work." Elijah glanced toward the front windows where another unmarked vehicle had quietly stopped outside. "The timing matters," he said softly. "It always has." Harper finally found his voice. I did not know." Marcus nodded. "That is correct. You were not supposed to know." There was no accusation in the statement, only a simple acknowledgement of how undercover operations functioned. The lead investigator from the arriving team looked toward Harper with quiet professionalism. "Officer, thank you for your cooperation. We will take it from here." Harper stepped back almost automatically, still processing everything he had witnessed. Around him, the tension inside the diner transformed into stunned silence. The room that only moments earlier had been filled with uncertainty was now filled with something entirely different. People were no longer wondering why two quiet black men had remained so calm under pressure. They finally understood that confidence had not come from defiance. It had come from discipline, preparation, and the responsibility of carrying a mission that could never be explained until the truth was ready to reveal itself. The lead investigator thanked the restaurant owner for remaining calm before quietly speaking into a small radio clipped beneath his jacket. Within moments, two additional members of the investigative team entered through separate doors, blending naturally into the diner without interrupting the customers who had slowly resumed their seats. Marcus Reed glanced once toward Elijah Brooks, and both men immediately shifted from the appearance of ordinary travelers to experienced investigators focused entirely on their assignment. The transition was subtle. Their voices remained calm. Their expressions remained measured. Yet every movement reflected years of training built on patience rather than urgency. Officer Daniel Harper stood silently beside the booth, replaying the past several minutes in his mind. He realized that every question he had asked and every conclusion he had reached had been based on assumptions rather than observable facts. Marcus noticed the officer's expression and spoke with the same steady tone he had used from the beginning. "Our objective today extends beyond this restaurant. We have been monitoring activity connected to an ongoing investigation for several months. Remaining unnoticed has been an important part of that work." Harper nodded slowly. "I understand now." Marcus answered with quiet professionalism. "The important thing is understanding what happened, not assigning blame before all the facts are known." The lead investigator briefly reviewed information with Marcus and Elijah while another member of the team positioned himself near the entrance, watching the parking lot through the front windows. Several vehicles continued passing along the highway exactly as they had all afternoon, making the scene outside appear completely ordinary. Inside the diner, however, every member of the investigative team remained attentive. Their calm demeanor concealed the precision with which every minute had been planned. The waitress approached cautiously and apologized for allowing their meals to become cold. Elijah smiled warmly and thanked her for her kindness. "You have been doing your job," he said. "That is all anyone can ask." The simple response eased some of the tension that had filled the room. Customers gradually returned to quiet conversations, although many continued watching with respectful curiosity. The owner walked toward Marcus and offered to prepare fresh lunches. Marcus accepted with appreciation, explaining that the investigation would allow only a few more minutes before the team needed to leave. Harper remained nearby, uncertain whether he should speak again. Finally, he looked directly at Marcus. "I should have slowed down before making conclusions." Marcus met his eyes without judgment. Every professional has moments that become lessons. What matters is whether those lessons change the next decision. Before another word could be exchanged, the lead investigator received a brief update through his earpiece. He acknowledged the message with a nod before turning toward Marcus. "Everything is in place." Marcus stood, adjusted his jacket, and exchanged one final glance with Elijah. The two detectives had entered the diner, hoping to remain invisible. Instead, circumstances had revealed their identities sooner than expected. Even so, their assignment continued, and every decision they made from this point forward would demonstrate the principle that had guided them throughout their careers. True authority is measured not by how loudly it is displayed, but by how carefully it is exercised. Marcus Reed gave one final acknowledgement to the lead investigator before the team quietly dispersed to the positions they had rehearsed long before arriving at the diner. Nothing dramatic followed. No raised voices echoed through the restaurant. No customer was asked to panic or leave. The operation continued exactly as it had been designed, with patience replacing urgency and preparation overcoming uncertainty. Through the front windows, the unmarked sport utility vehicles slowly pulled away while another plain sedan rolled into a parking space across the street. To everyone else, the traffic looked ordinary. To the investigative team, every arrival and departure confirmed that months of careful planning were moving toward their intended conclusion. Elijah Brooks remained near the entrance for several moments, casually speaking with one of the investigators while quietly observing the reflections in the glass. Marcus thanked the waitress for her professionalism and apologized that their lunch had been interrupted. She smiled with visible relief. "I had no idea who you were," she admitted. Marcus answered gently. "That means we were doing our job." The owner stepped forward and insisted that the meals would be complimentary. Marcus politely declined the offer. "We appreciate your kindness, but we pay for our meals the same as everyone else." The owner accepted the payment with a grateful handshake, recognizing that the respect shown by the two detectives carried far more weight than any official title. A few minutes later, the lead investigator received another quiet update through his earpiece. He looked toward Marcus and gave a subtle nod. "The surveillance phase is complete. Our partners have confirmed the next location." Marcus acknowledged the message and turned toward Elijah. Neither man celebrated. Neither spoke with excitement. They simply gathered their belongings with the quiet discipline that had carried them through countless assignments. Officer Daniel Harper remained standing near the booth, watching every movement with a completely different perspective than he had only a short time earlier. The certainty that had guided him when he first approached the table had been replaced by reflection. He realized that he had spent more time trusting assumptions than observing actions. Marcus noticed him before walking toward the exit. "Officer Harper," he said calmly, "today could have ended very differently if frustration had replaced professionalism. I appreciate that you kept this conversation respectful even when we disagreed." Harper lowered his eyes briefly before answering. "I should have paid closer attention to what you were actually doing instead of what I believed." Marcus nodded once. Authority is strongest when it begins with fairness. Respect should never depend on a badge, a title, or assumptions about a stranger. It should begin with the simple decision to see people clearly. Harper quietly absorbed every word. There was nothing left to argue. The lesson had arrived without humiliation and without anger. As Marcus and Elijah walked toward the door, several customers offered small nods of appreciation. The detectives returned each gesture with quiet courtesy before stepping into the warm Texas afternoon alongside the rest of their team. Their assignment was not finished. Another destination awaited them beyond the highway, and another chapter of the investigation had already begun. Behind them, inside the familiar walls of Miller's Diner, the lunch crowd slowly returned to ordinary conversation, but one thing had changed forever. Everyone who had witnessed the afternoon understood that real professionalism rarely announced itself. True character often arrived without recognition, and the strongest form of justice was built not on power alone, but on the discipline to treat every person with dignity before the truth was fully known. The investigation moved forward without public attention, exactly as Marcus Reed and Elijah Brooks had hoped from the beginning. Before sunset, the coordinated effort between multiple agencies quietly reached its planned objective, confirming months of careful surveillance and patient detective work. There were no dramatic announcements and no celebration. Success arrived in the same disciplined manner that had guided every decision throughout the operation. By the following week, the official reports had been completed, interviews had been documented, and every member of the investigative team returned to regular assignments. Officer Daniel Harper, however, found himself returning to the events at Miller's Diner more often than he expected. He replayed each conversation in his mind, remembering how confidently he had trusted first impressions instead of observable facts. The experience remained with him long after the paperwork had been filed away. During a departmental review, Harper openly described the encounter to his supervising lieutenant. He did not attempt to justify his decisions or minimize his mistakes. Instead, he explained exactly how assumptions had influenced his judgment and how differently the situation appeared once the complete truth became known. The lieutenant listened carefully before reminding everyone present that effective policing depended as much on patience as it did on authority. The discussion became part of a broader training session focused on communication, professional conduct, and the importance of evaluating behavior rather than relying on personal expectations. Harper accepted the feedback without argument. He understood that real growth began when a difficult lesson was acknowledged instead of avoided. Several days later, Marcus and Elijah completed another assignment in a neighboring county before driving back toward Dallas. The long Texas highway stretched beneath a warm afternoon sky as they reflected quietly on the previous week. Elijah glanced toward Marcus with a small smile. "You never raised your voice once." Marcus looked through the windshield before answering. "People remember how you carry yourself long after they forget the volume of your words." Elijah nodded. "That diner reminded me that respect is tested most when nobody knows who you are." Marcus agreed. If respect only appears after credentials are revealed, then it was never respect in the first place. Their conversation ended there, replaced by the comfortable silence shared by partners who had worked together for years. Each understood that the badge inside a jacket pocket represented responsibility, not privilege. Meanwhile, life at Miller's Diner slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Customers filled the booths during breakfast and lunch. Coffee continued flowing across the counter, and the owner occasionally found himself remembering the extraordinary afternoon that had unfolded inside his ordinary restaurant. Whenever someone mentioned the story, he always described the same detail first. He never talked about the investigation or the surprise reveal. Instead, he remembered how calm the two detectives had remained while everyone around them grew uncertain. That quiet professionalism had left the deepest impression. Officer Harper also carried the memory with him each time he began a new shift. Before approaching unfamiliar situations, he found himself taking one extra moment to observe, to listen, and to separate facts from assumptions. It was a small change, almost invisible to those around him, yet it influenced every conversation that followed. Sometimes the greatest turning point in a career does not arrive through recognition or promotion. Sometimes it begins with a simple lunch, an unexpected lesson, and the willingness to become a better version of the person who first walked through the door. Several months passed before Marcus Reed and Elijah Brooks found themselves driving along the same stretch of Texas highway once again. Another assignment had brought them within a few miles of Miller's Diner, and as the familiar roadside sign appeared in the afternoon sunlight, Elijah smiled. "It has been a while." Marcus glanced toward the building and nodded. Long enough for people to remember the lesson instead of the surprise. They pulled into the parking lot without unmarked vehicles following them, without hidden surveillance teams, and without the weight of an active operation resting on their shoulders. This time, they were simply two detectives stopping for a late lunch before continuing the drive back to Dallas. The bell above the front door chimed softly as they stepped inside. The familiar aroma of fresh coffee and grilled sandwiches filled the air exactly as it had months before. The owner looked up from behind the counter, recognized them almost immediately, and greeted them with a broad smile. "Welcome back, gentlemen. It is good to see you again." Several regular customers glanced toward the entrance with quiet curiosity, though few recognized the visitors who had once been at the center of an unforgettable afternoon. Before either detective could answer, Officer Daniel Harper entered through the opposite door during his routine patrol. For a brief moment, everyone noticed the coincidence. Harper looked across the room, immediately recognized Marcus and Elijah, and walked toward them with an easy, respectful smile. "Good afternoon, detectives," he said. "It is good to see you both again." Marcus extended his hand, and Harper shook it without hesitation. There was no tension, no uncertainty, and no need for explanations. Elijah smiled warmly. "Looks like lunch is quieter today." Harper gave a light laugh. "That is how I hope every lunch stays." They spoke for several minutes about the weather, the long highway, and the ordinary rhythm of work that connected every law enforcement professional regardless of assignment or agency. The conversation was simple, but it reflected something that had changed inside each of them. Harper no longer searched for reasons to doubt before observing facts. Marcus and Elijah appreciated seeing an officer willing to learn rather than defend old mistakes. The waitress recognized the detectives as well and walked over carrying 3 fresh cups of coffee. "This one is on the house," she said with a smile. Marcus thanked her but insisted on paying anyway, just as he had before. "Kindness is enough," he replied. Around them, the diner continued serving travelers, families, truck drivers, and local residents without distinction. Every booth held a different story, yet everyone received the same welcome when they walked through the door. As Marcus and Elijah prepared to leave, Harper held the entrance open for an elderly couple arriving for lunch before turning back toward the detectives. Marcus paused for a moment and looked around the room. Nothing appeared extraordinary anymore, and perhaps that was the greatest sign that something meaningful had changed. Justice had never depended upon exposing hidden credentials or proving who carried greater authority. It had always depended upon the quiet decision to treat every person with fairness before knowing their story. As the detectives stepped into the warm Texas afternoon and continued down the highway, the diner disappeared behind them once more, but the lesson remained where it belonged. Character is revealed long before credentials are.